we're going to talk about something called conflict. So I want you to turn to page 135, and I want you to look at that couple. Now, they're a little different than some of the other couples we've looked at. In fact, they're not real happy looking. Do you notice that? How would you like to be that couple that had their picture taken anonymously at the Family Life Conference? I think they're in the middle of something. Does anybody else think that? Well, I've taken some pictures of some of you this weekend that may be in the next manual, so get ready. You thought when you were walking along the beach that was private. Well. All right, I tell you what. We're going to talk about conflict. Anybody got any conflict in here? High five your wife, guys, if you've ever had conflict, all right? That's right. Yeah, we've all had a little conflict. Yeah, this one woman slapped her husband when he did that. Because I've been meaning to talk to you about that. Well, conflict. We all got it. I got conflict. You got conflict. All God's children got what? Conflict. That's right. We got it. You see, it's not if we have it. It's when we have it. What are we going to do with it? Now, I've done some surveying across the country, and so here's some research that I've done, and I'm going to get a little feedback from you, and you can just kind of help me and participate with this. And we'll see if anybody here has got conflict. One of you in your marital relationship, when you get the toothpaste tube, you take that thing and you kind of just squeeze it in the middle. Now, how many of you do that? My wife does. That's right. Yeah, your wife does. Thanks, bro. You want to stand up and introduce her? Yeah. And a question I've been wondering, and I've been wanting to ask a few of you, how many of you don't use toothpaste? Yeah. How about this one? We talked about TPing the other night, Friday night. And when you get the toilet paper roll and you put it on the spindle, how many of you do it so it rolls off the top? Let's raise your hands. I want to get a good look at you. Yeah, Ted, you do, bro. And how many of you do it so it comes off the bottom? You are sick people. I knew it. One of you is a night person. You know, you love to stay up late at night. My wife's like that, you know. Yeah, I know, bro. And the other one of you is a morning person. Any conflicts like that in marriages in here? One's a morning person, one's a night person? Yeah, why does God bring us together like that? I tell you, Sarah, my oldest, and my wife are both night people. Missy, my youngest, and I are both morning people. We both get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, all bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. You know, we want to talk, you know? And so we get up, hey, Missy, how you doing? Good, Dad, how are you? You know, and we're just kind of going, and Barb and Sarah, they just wish that, you know, they would never get up, I think is what they wish. We like to get up at the crack of dawn. They get up at the crack of noon. That's when they get to get up. One of you likes the room absolutely dark at night. Yeah, I mean, you get out the, you know, mechanical tape. You tape the windows, and you put towels under the door so you can't see the light from the hallway. And the other one, well, you still carry your Mickey Mouse nightlight everywhere you go. Some of you are going to forget it. Go up to your room and get it. And Barb loves it absolutely dark in the bedroom. And when we travel and do these conferences, you know those little message lights on the telephone? Well, Barbara carries a thimble. And she puts it over that light. Because she doesn't want any light. We never get messages all weekend. It's great. And how about this one? One of you likes to arrive 15 minutes early for every event that you go to. Yeah, and some of you guys have not heard the national anthem since you got married. I got conflict. You got conflict. All God's children got conflict. That's right. So what we're going to talk about during this hour is literally how to deal with conflict. And a couple years ago, when I wrote Choosing to Love Again, I also talked to the Family Life Ministry, and they said, you know, Rosberg, why don't you just write this talk? And so I wrote this thing, and it's based on the book, and it literally deals with the anatomy of a conflict. It deals with the anatomy. So I'm going to take you all the way through a conflict and help you learn how it starts and how it wraps up, all right? Now, in order to do that, we're going to do a little bit of artwork here. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to the picture of this couple that looks a little bit honked off, all right? And I want you to draw a circle around the frame of them, if you will. So just draw a circle around their picture, kind of like the face of a clock. And now, just like on the face of the clock, I want you to write the numbers where the hands of the clock would go at 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and 11 o'clock. So, for instance, you put a 1, a 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, all the way around. Just do those numbers. And I promise this will make sense someday. No, it'll make sense here in a few minutes. And what we're going to do is I'm going to take you through the stages of a conflict, and I correlate this to something called the opening and the closing of a loop. In other words, the opening of a conflict occurs when we open a loop, and we open a loop at 1 o'clock, something happens, then something happens at 3 o'clock, at 5, at 7, at 9, and 11. And I'm going to walk you through those stages and help you understand what happens when we deal with a conflict. Okay? So you can go back to that page and you will fill in the blank next to each of those numbers. It's an imaginary blank because it's blank. And you can write the word that describes that stage of the conflict. But let's turn to page 136. We'll get started, and this will all make sense. Letter A, conflict is common to all marriages. That's the understatement of the year. Oh, buddy. Conflict is common to all marriages. Therefore, the goal of marriage is not to be conflict-free, but to handle conflict correctly when it occurs. Yes. You see, everyone's got conflict. A lot of people think, well, you don't have conflict when you're dating, in pre-marriage. Oh, yes, you do. And there's a couple that I wrote about that were just real dear people, and I was treating them a couple years ago, and they were getting ready for marriage. And the guy was 36, the gal was 34. And they were getting ready to get married. They dated for 11 years. This guy had what we call a fear of commitment. But Hazel held on and Bubba came around. And they were both real meticulous and real orderly and, a little bit straight. And they'd come in and they came to me for counseling. So it was kind of interesting. But anyway, they're sitting there on the sofa one day. And it was one of our last sessions. And they were getting married between Thanksgiving and Christmas 3 years ago. And this was just about a couple weeks before Thanksgiving. And so I go through all sorts of things in premarital counseling, but I got to the issue of conflict. And I said, all right, let's talk about conflict. This is one of my favorite topics, and let's talk about this. And they said, all right. And I said, you guys, what do you do when you have conflict? And then I sat back, got my pen out, and got ready to take notes. And they said, well, Dr. Rosberg, they call me doctor, and I thought, and they said, Dr. Rosberg, we've never had conflict. And I said, well, let me rephrase the question. When you have, when you're ticked off, you have kind of a fight with each other, an argument, how do you deal with it? Then I sat back waiting for the answer, and they said, well, Gary, we've never had an argument. I said, you've never had an argument? They said, no. And I went to check their pulse and make sure they were alive. I said, you guys been dating 11 years, and you've never had an argument? And they looked at each other and kind of grabbed each other's hands and squished up their nose, like pre-marrieds do. And I looked at them, and I thought I was in the Twilight Zone, And I said, you've never had a conflict? No. I said, gee, all right. And I said, now you guys are getting married between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And they said, yeah. That's why I got a question. Where are you spending your last Thanksgiving as single adults? And they looked like two parakeets, on a little stick. And at the exact same time, they said, my parents' house. Then they turned to each other, and I went, we got a conflict. Yeah, see, the secret of being a marriage counselor is if they don't have problems before they come in, we give them to them. All marriages suffer from various degrees of pain and anger brought on by a partner's offense. All right, so all couples have varying degrees of pain brought on by a partner's offense. So in fact, what I'm going to suggest is at 1 o'clock is where a loop is open, and that's where an offense occurs. So looking at the anatomy of a conflict, it starts at the 1 o'clock hour when the offense occurs. Now, you ever been offended by somebody? Oh, buddy. Yep. And when we open a loop, when we offend somebody, sometimes those offenses are little dinky offenses. Guys, it's like you're sitting around the family room, and you're getting ready to watch a game, and your wife gets up and gets a Diet Coke out of the fridge and, and comes back and plops down next to you, and you look at her and you go, well, where's my Diet Coke? An open loop, Or, you don't get invited to a potluck dinner at church. I'm always thankful when I don't get invited. But most people like to go to those things, And so they have an open loop. Or you hear that some friends are getting together and 3 different couples, and you've always kind of been the 4th couple, and you find out that somebody was kind of talking about you the next day after that party. An open loop. You see, the offenses are becoming a little bit more important and significant, aren't they? For some of you, it's the offense, and a loop opens up when a parent betrays you or wounds you. For some of you, it's in the marriage. And for some of you, it's the full-blown open loop and the hammering away of a tender heart through adultery or deep, deep pain within a relationship. For some of you, it's the rebellion of a child, a prodigal. And you'll hear more about a prodigal here in a few minutes. For some of you, it's the wounding from friendships or within your churches or by a board in a church that perhaps dealt with something that deeply wounded you and offended you. But see, the bottom line, folks, is when we are offended, we all experience an emotion. And it's the same emotion, but a lot of us like to zoom through it. And it's what letter C says. The choices you make during a conflict will either bind you together or drive you apart and then lead to letter D, and that's the emotion of hurt. You see, when I'm offended, I feel hurt. When you're offended, you feel hurt. And hurt is what occurs at the 3 o'clock hour on the clock. And I know there's a lot of paper shuffling, but it will make sense later. In other words, when you're offended, what I'm going to suggest is you feel hurt. Now, how many of you like feeling hurt? Put your paws in the air. Yeah, I'm glad nobody raised their hand because I was going to do an hour with you later. See, that would be kind of masochistic. Now a lot of hands go up, I can see. But see, that would be masochistic to want to feel hurt. And you know what? A lot of us don't even realize we're feeling hurt because hurt leaves us so vulnerable and we're transparent. So we zoom right through it and we get on with a little bit more empowering emotion. And we'll see what that is in a moment. But you ever been hurt? And when you're hurt, it kind of feels like, you know, your chest is ripped open and your heart's exposed to this other person. And you feel fear. And you feel wounded and you feel betrayed and you feel scared. And you don't know if you can communicate with anybody because you don't know if you can trust anybody. Because the last time you communicated with somebody, they went and told somebody else. And so what we do is we begin to isolate, we begin to shut down. But hurt is hurt is hurt. And whatever culture you live in, whatever age you are, whatever background you have, we all have experienced hurt. But many of us deal with our hurt by zooming right through it, and we get to the next couple statements there. We do a couple different things with it. Number one, we stuff it. We stuff it. We push it down, ladies and gentlemen. Because if we're feeling hurt and we don't feel safe enough to communicate about it, then we just sit on it. We can call that repression. We can call that any number of things. But we hold it in. But you know what happens is it's kind of the birth of a dragon is what happens. Because as we begin to feed that thing, the thing begins to grow. I was treating a guy several years ago. And guy out there in Des Moines, Iowa. And a businessman, business executive, and had a lot of issues around hurt in his life. And I won't go into those. But as we were sitting there talking one day, he said, you know, Rosberg, he said, when I am deeply offended and I begin to feel hurt, it's kind of like there's a birth of a dragon. And he said, it's kind of like I can see that little dragon right in your office over there in the corner. Do you see it? And I said, no, bro, I don't see it, but tell me about it. He said, well, it's kind of like there's this little pipsqueak of a dragon, and it's over there kind of blowing smoke out of his nose, you know. And it's kind of blowing little flames, but he's just a little dragon. But you know what I do when I'm hurt? I start to feed the dragon. It's like I'm throwing chunks of meat at it, and all of a sudden, instead of a little tiny dragon, it becomes a little bit bigger dragon. And then I throw some more power at it, and it gets bigger and bigger to the point, Gary, where it kind of begins to engulf the room. And what I have learned, Rosberg, is that sometimes I need to take out the sword and I need to slay the dragon. You see, hurt is hurt. And what a lot of us do is we feed it by stuffing it. Others feed it by blowing it, and that's number two. In other words, we begin to feed it, and instead of pushing it down, it begins to just blow out of nowhere. And it starts to explode. And it comes out in aggressive and hostile outbursts. And we kind of wound everybody around us. I call this it's kind of like being a loaded cannon. And you know, you've got the gunpowder in there, and you got, you know, the musket, and you push that, you know, cannonball down in there, and you're standing around handing out matches to see who's going to light the fuse. You see, you're a cannon just being ready to be lit. And when we are offended and we are hurt, we either stuff it or we explode it. But when we explode it, it's like sitting at the foot of Mount St. Helens, and people all around us experience the pain of that. So what are we going to do when we're offended and we are hurt? What we need to do is we need to deal with the third step of the anatomy of a conflict, and that's at the 5 o'clock hour, and that is the emotion of anger. Anger. Resolving conflict requires understanding the anatomy of anger. Let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Now that is a good word. Now how many of you were taught in the home that you grew up in to deal with your anger? How many of you were taught? How many of you were instructed on how to deal with anger? Not many. Now let me ask you again, how many of you were taught on how to deal with anger? Probably a lot of us. That's right. Because you were taught something. You were taught by parents, siblings, grandparents, it doesn't matter. And for some of you, the way you were taught was by the modeling of it. And you would live with somebody who was kind of a cannon that was exploding all over. And what you learned to do is to shut yourself down because you knew that you couldn't trust in those relationships. For the others of you, you learned that the thing that you need to do is to hold it in and repress it. And you had a mom or a dad that walked around trying to wipe up all the messes and keep everything antiseptic in that family. And so you learned to feel strong emotion, but don't express strong emotion. Or maybe you grew up in a church that said, don't feel angry. That's not what Scripture says. What Scripture says is, be angry, but what? Sin not. You see, God gave us the emotion of anger. You know, it's wild, but you can call my daughters, and you can ask them, what is the one emotion your father's teaching you? You know what it is? It's anger. I am instructing my daughters on how to deal with anger more than any other emotion. You know why? Because I don't want them growing up and getting into relationships with men and not be able to express the deep, deep pain of their hearts as they go through life. Because we live in a culture where at times we are offended. And you know what? Sometimes it's all right to be angry. Sometimes it's all right to be angry. But we need to not sin in our anger. We need to be able to go to another person and say, you know what? I am feeling hurt. I'm not only feeling hurt, I'm feeling anger. Was Jesus Christ ever angry? Oh, yeah, he was angry. Give me some examples. Where was he angry? Bro, with the money changers in the temple. Can you imagine our Lord going into the temple and seeing these chumps in there, you know, doing this exchange and all this stuff? He was angry. That is righteous anger. I think he might have been angry when he was in Gethsemane. And what did he ask the disciples to do? Do you remember? Pray. And what did they do? They slept. And he said, you can't even stay alert and pray? Do you think there's any anger in his heart? I don't know. I wonder. I don't know the answer. You see, when we are betrayed, when we are hurt, when we are wounded, sometimes we need to feel anger. Not inappropriate anger, ladies and gentlemen. But please, don't run away from it. God gave that emotion to you. And some of us need to face it off. It is part of who we are. But what do we do? Well, number one says, why do we show it? Well, we show it when our rights have been violated. You ever had your rights violated? Yeah. And I don't want examples, but I'm going to give you a few. Let me give you one. And again, what you're learning about me is I've blown it a lot, all right? So let me confess one more to you. But it was in winter about 5 or 6 years ago. And we were on our way to church, and it was one of those perfect snowfalls. And I told the girls on the way in, I said, you guys, after church, we're going to make a memory. And my 3 girls, including Barb, said, what are we going to do? And I said, well, I'll tell you later. They said, well, you got to tell us now. You can't do that to us. And I said, oh, yeah, I just did it. I tell them, I don't have to be fair. I'm the dad. So anyway, we go into church. We worship God. We come out, and I said, all right, everyone go home and get dressed, real warm. And they said, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to go out and make our first ever snowman. As a family, the 4 of us. We went out, we started making the snowman, and it was great. And we were having fun. We're doing angels in the snow, and having snowball fights. But what Barb and I weren't prepared for was that Missy began to fall in love with the snowman. And here's this little adoring girl, and she's hugging it, and putting the carrot, in the charcoal and the Oshkosh Bagosh hat on this thing, and a little my scarf, and wrapping the scarf. And we have movies of Missy with the snowman. It's incredible. I said, Missy, what are you going to name the snowman? She goes, well, Frosty. She was pretty indignant, and I said, well, yeah, what's wrong with me? All right. So we named it Frosty. So that evening, after a long day of having a lot of fun and a great family time, I said, girls, let's go out and look at Christmas tree lights. And then Missy came to me and she said, Daddy, I don't think we ought to leave. And I said, why? And she said, well, Eric, the reason I don't have sons, told me that he might tear down my snowman. And I said, well, that little squirt's not going to tear down your snowman, honey. Don't worry about that. And she said, no, Daddy, I think he might. And I said, well, Missy, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. So we went in the car, came back an hour later. Frosty was blown to smithereens. Now, just don't mess with my family. It's kind of my motto, you know. My dad taught me that. You'll hear about that in a minute. But anyway, Missy's crying, Sarah's fuming, Barb's not happy. So what do? I start marching across the street to Eric's house. And I knock on the door with a little bit of enthusiasm, and Eric comes to the door, and I started ripping this young man. I mean, he's only this tall, you know. But I said, Eric, why did you, Missy loves that. And he's going, Gary, I didn't do it. And I said, oh, yeah, you didn't do it. And I just kind of vomited all over this kid. Is what I was doing. It's a spiritual term. It's in 1 John. Anyway, so I thought, I've had it with you kids, man, you boys, I got girls. You got to be nice to girls. Don't you honor women? I'm just yelling at this kid. So I go back, and I start putting snowman back together, and Missy's crying. Everyone's mad. Well, then I hear these people walking across the street. And they're kind of loud footsteps. And I turn around. There's Eric, but with him is his father. And his dad looks, and I never met his dad, they just moved in the neighborhood. And he said, you Rosberg? And I go, yeah. And he goes, you got something to say to me? And I go, no. And he said, well, you had something to say to my son. And I said, well, yeah, I did, the little squirt, and I started going. He said, Rosberg, he has been inside all day long. And I said, all day? And he goes, yeah. And I said, you mean he didn't tear down the snowman? He said, no, Gary, he didn't. And I went, oh, man. I said, well, and he said, don't ever talk to my son. I mean, this guy was doing a great job as a father. I mean, I wanted to high-five the guy, So he goes back across the street. I turn around, and there's Missy. And I go, Missy, did Eric say he was going to tear down the snowman? And she said, no, Daddy, I just thought he might. I said, in the house. So we all sat down in the house, and I said, we got to have a family meeting. And I said, you guys, we have really dropped the ball. And I said, Missy, I don't think you did it. And she goes, yeah, I don't either now. And I go. I said, well, honey, thank you for being my daughter right now, And so I said, you guys, I don't like this one at all. I said, but we got to do something about this. So I said, I'm going to go call. What's Eric's phone number? And they gave it to me. And I call, and the father reluctantly comes to the phone. And I said, sir, this is your neighbor. And he goes, yeah, I know who it is. And I said, can we come over and talk to you? And I said, I need to close the loop. And the guy said, I don't want to talk to you. And I said, well, you don't have to talk. Will you listen? He goes, all right. So I looked at my 3 girls. One of them said, I'm not going. The second one said, I have to throw up. And the third one said, you're the dad. Now, one of those is Barbara. I'm not telling you which one, because I promised her. But anyway, we go across the street, and it is the slowest walk of my life. We ring the doorbell. Eric comes. He's looking pretty cocky. His dad comes. And I just said, I told this guy, I said, we have blown it. I've blown it. I'm the dad, And I said, hey, I'll take the heat. You're right, you guys, they didn't do it. And the father goes, oh, Gary, it's okay. It's not that big a deal. And I said, well, it is a big deal. And then Eric, kind of starts to hug Missy, and Missy's hugging Eric, and she's crying. She cries all the time. And they're all, we're all high-fiving each other. And so then I go to leave, and Eric goes, Gary, I know who did it. And I said, I don't want to know. 3 months later, I'm at Cross Trainers. I'm back getting a donut. One of my sidekicks is teaching. And this guy goes, hey, Rosberg, I want to introduce you to somebody. I go, oh, good. And I look, and it's Eric's father. He came to visit, and he goes, well, Gary, do you go to Cross Trainers? I said, yeah, I do. Good witness, huh? Anyway, you see, forgiveness is forgiveness is forgiveness. Right? You ever blown it? Tell me somebody's blown it in here. That's right. All right. And we blow it when our rights have been violated. I violated the rights. Letter B says, we also show anger when our expectations have not been met. When our expectations have not been met. That's a hard one. You see, we have expectations that everything should be okay. We enter into relationships with friends and marriages, with our folks, with kids. We enter in and we believe that everything's going to be okay, that we're going to be dealt with in an appropriate and reasonable way. And sometimes we're not. We're not. And when those expectations are dashed, then we feel strong emotion. And letter C, we also show anger when we have been hurt or we've been wounded. Now, number 2 says, for some people it's safer to show anger than to acknowledge hurt. Again, because we may have grown up not legitimizing our hurt. So we zoom right into the anger because the anger is empowering. And it's safer to show anger. And folks, when somebody is showing anger, whether it's a child or a mate or a friend, here's my encouragement to you, is to go to them and say, are you hurt? Are you scared? Because many times that's what the root of the anger is hurt or fear. And sometimes we need to get underneath it to understand it. Letter B says anger is a God-given emotion. It can be a motivation to resolve conflict. I know one couple that looked at this scripture, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. And they wanted to take the scripture literally. They were having a conflict one night. They couldn't resolve it. They stayed up for 2.5 weeks. Yeah, they didn't understand the scripture. All right, turn to the next page. Anger can be a powerful weapon. Top of 138. It's a powerful weapon. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you. But you must master it. You see, anger is a strong, strong weapon. And if it's not controlled, ladies and gentlemen, it leads us into sin. Letter D says anger must be controlled. Uncontrolled anger results in 3 things. Bitterness, that will end up as resentment, depression, and conflict with the Father. You see, if you look at the anatomy of a hurt or a pain, it goes from an offense to hurt to anger. Unresolved goes to resentment and bitterness and depression. Now, is anger sin? No, it's not. Is resentment sin? Oh, buddy. Is bitterness sin? Yeah. Is depression sin? No. Just seeing if you're with me. See, depression is not sin. And I wish I had another hour to talk about depression. Because 20% of us will experience it at some point in our life. And a lot of us as believers have got this funky perception about this thing. That it is rooted in sin and it's rooted in something's wrong with your spiritual life. And folks, we have beat people up for years. Stop beating them up. Because if you've never been depressed, you don't know the experience of it. And if somebody is depressed, push them towards their physician. Let them get help for it. There are remarkable things through counseling, through antidepressant medications that are saving people's lives. And I wish I could tell you the case after case after case of good people that love Jesus Christ, that have developed a biochemical imbalance, in that when they went through the treatment of it by their medical staff and therapeutic staff, they are living again. So be sensitive to that. Be sensitive to that. It's striking people left and right. You with me? It's a hard one. Christians don't like this one. They get do-do-do-do in their head when they think about it. All right. Anger must be controlled. Look at letter E. Unresolved conflict can multiply the intensity of future conflicts. Unresolved conflict can multiply the intensity. Look at that couple. Look at him. And there's the guy, he's got that clicker in his hand. He's turning on the TV. Got the wall. The woman's reading the book. These guys, one brick at a time, have put up a wall that have separated them. And it's killing them. It's killing them. Does that look familiar to anybody? That's right. All right, let's turn the page before we get too much into this. All right. Resolving conflict. Resolving conflict requires loving confrontation. At 1 o'clock is the offense, at 3 o'clock is the hurt, at 5 o'clock is the anger, and 7 o'clock is where we begin to close the loop. It's loving confrontation. Loving confrontation. Here's what it means. It means that when we are wounded and we are hurt and we are angry, what we may do is go out and self-protect for a time and put up a wall of self-protection around ourselves. But what we need to do is we need to step back into the relationship and pursue a resolution of it. And it means that when we go back to that person to talk about it, we need to do it in love. And we need to do it in prayer. And we need to do it with great, great honor and respect of that other person. Letter E says, speak the truth in love. It is really showing Paul's words there in Ephesians. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects unto him, who is the head, even Christ. Speak the truth in love. There's nothing worse than when you have offended somebody, they have the other person come to you like a shotgun and just nail you on it. Speak it in love. Be gracious. Be honoring with that person. Letter B, approach the confrontation carefully. Approach it carefully. Brethren, even if a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. Do it with grace. Do it tenderly. I tell you, Barb and I, it took us 7 or 8 years to really figure out how to communicate. And one of the things that we learned is that we communicate differently. And I call it, it's analogous to the way we dress a Christmas tree. All right? This will make sense. When you get a Christmas tree and you put that thing up, and I'm going to talk about one in a moment, but you put up a Christmas tree, some of you, you like to put all the ornaments on it, and, you like to string all the string. It takes about 6 days to do it, And then at the very end, what you do is you take the star or the angel and you put it up on the top, and there's a drum roll and crescendoing, and, it's this wonderful experience, all right? And that's how a lot of people dress a Christmas tree, and that's how they communicate. They kind of communicate by just kind of dressing this thing and putting in all the minutia and, and all the technicolor, and they dress it, and the other person's listening, going, okay, let's land that plane, dear, And then at the end, we kind of put the tree, we're going, all right, we finally got it. Well, that's how Barbara communicates. Now, she's a better communicator than I am, but it drives me crazy sometimes. And for 7 or 8 years, I couldn't figure out how to help our communication because I kept sitting there thinking, let's get to the punchline, dear. Now, me, when I dress a Christmas tree, all right, first of all, I bring that sucker in the house, scraping paint everywhere, and then I put it in one of those stands. Those stands are demon-possessed. They're, putting those little screws in there, and Barb and the girls are back there. No, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. I want to go strangle somebody, and I'm in there doing that thing. Well, you know what I do? I get up, I look at it. I want to put the angel right on the top of that thing because I want to know where I'm going. See, that's my plumb line. Then I kind of throw a couple ornaments, and then I go watch a game. That's how I dress a Christmas tree. And that's how I communicate. Now, here's the point, because some of you are wondering. I can do this. I'm going to tie it together. You wait. Here's what Barb and I learned. When we sit in those little mauve chairs in the living room every night at about 5:30 for an hour and talk, 45 minutes or an hour, what we have learned is if she needs to communicate something to me, she gives me the punchline first. She says, you know what, Gary, I cracked up the car, nobody died. I go, good for you. All right, now, tell me what happened. But what I have learned is to serve her and to submit to her need, and I will stay there as she dresses the thing and tells me everything. Okay? Because I want to communicate with her. But I don't want to sit around all day waiting for her to tell me, that she cracked up the car. I want to know. And literally, if you could watch us communicate, she has learned to love me by communicating the way I need to be communicated with. But you know what? I communicate the way she wants to communicate. So I don't come home and say, Barb, I quit my job today. No, because that would blow her out of the water. All right, so what I do is I come home and say, you know what, honey, I kind of need to talk to you about something. And I'm kind of counting the words, making sure I'm doing this right. And I just kind of weave it, and, And when I was talking to that guy, he had a blue shirt on and a green tie. And the Bee Gees were playing in the background. And, I'll go forever if I have to. And then I'll say, and by the way, I quit my job. And, we just kind of work through this thing. But see, that's how we communicate. See, the key is not to force your mate to communicate your way. The key is to learn how they communicate and then minister to them through that process. So when we're speaking to them, we need to do it in love, but we need to do it carefully. Number one, check your motivation. Why are you confronting that person? Is it to control them? Is it to resolve it? Number two, check your attitude. Number three, the circumstances, the timing, the setting, the pressures. There are times not to deal with conflict. One of them is when you're dropping a kid off at school on a 6-lane highway and they go to get out of the car and you go, by the way, you're grounded. Some of us have done that. I've done that. You've never done that? Anyway, you don't communicate during those times, all right? Let me tell you another time we don't communicate much in our house is Sunday morning before church. Because every Sunday morning we have this. Does anybody else have this? What is the story on that? The Rosbergs get along pretty well 6 days a week. Sunday morning, it's worthless, because part of the problem, I have to admit, a little bit of it, maybe just a tiny bit of it is me. Because I get up about 5:30 every morning, 7 days a week, and I'm kind of alert like this, looking around. I go downstairs, do my Bible study, let bro out, have a bowl of Wheaties, do my treadmill, and by 7:15, 7:30, I'm ready for the day. Well, the problem is church doesn't start till 9. And so I start kind of pacing, the hallway downstairs, and every once in a while bark up a gentle, gracious order like, are you almost ready? Now, they're upstairs, having wars with curling irons, and dippity-doo is dripping from the ceiling, Now they're all the same size, so they're all stealing each other's clothes. Invariably, somebody comes down with some nylons with a run in them, And they always bring it to me and go, look at this. Every Sunday I say the same thing. I didn't wear them. I didn't do it. No, I'm not going to the store to get new ones, you know. So at about 8:30, I go out in the car. You know, because I'm ready to sin, you know, and so I go out there to sin. And about 8:35, I start beeping the horn. You know, maybe Eric's dad will go to church. I'm evangelizing the neighborhood, you know. And I sit out there. We only live 3 minutes from church, so that's the problem. But I'm out there, and my girls come out in the same order every week. Missy comes first. Now, Missy has this kind of this congenital eye weird thing that when she's either lying or very upset, she gets something called the blinky eye syndrome. And she starts doing this. Missy, did you do your homework? Yeah, Dad. Go do it. She does. I mean, she'll never lie to her husband. She's, you know. So Missy comes out through the garage first, and she's doing this, you know. And I go, just get in the car and be quiet, Missy. Oh, praise the Lord, Dad. All right. Sarah's the perfectionist. She's the harpist, you know, elegant, cool girl. She comes walking through the garage. I said, just get in the car. And just shut up. We're going to church to learn about Jesus. And every week I do it, and the girls tell me not to, but I grab the garage door closer. And I know just when to push the button to get Barb's afterburner going. And every Sunday the girls go, Daddy, don't do it, Daddy, don't do it. And I push that thing. Has anybody been there? Yes. We do, and we hurt each other, and we offend each other. And folks, we need to check the motivation, the attitude, the circumstances. And then number 4, check to see if you're willing to accept confrontation as well as give it. Yeah. Letter C, agree on the way you're going to discuss resolving the conflict. Now, this is a whole talk in itself. Focus on these things rather than these. Focus on one issue at a time. One issue. Yeah, this is what I do in therapy. So I'm going to give you a little therapeutic insight here. And I tell couples, one issue, just one. And a lot of people in nanoseconds will throw 8 issues on the table. You know? I mean, they want to get their money's worth in counseling, I guess, is what they're doing. And I'm always kind of bringing them back. And I'm saying, all right, let's just stick with one issue. We can't deal with all these. Let's just stick with one. But a lot of us like to get into many issues. Deal with the problem, not the person. Okay? The behavior, not the character. That's a good one. Don't call the other person's character. Specifics rather than generalizations. Now, this one is, would you circle that one? Men and ladies, terms like nobody. If only once. Guys, saying to your wife, you never. You always. Yeah, those are, you need to push a button or something and get everyone's attention. Because anytime people do those, use those generalizations, it just, I hear it instantly when people do that. And I just kind of cringe. Because as soon as somebody makes a generalization, the other person becomes what? Defensive. Because they're sitting there clickety-clacketing through their computer chips, trying to come up with an example when they one time did it differently. And I tell the person who is expressing their hurt that you're losing your argument. Go ahead and stick with the argument you got. Just don't say always. See, because you lose the validity of it. Now, being a therapist, being trained and all this stuff, being a national certified guy, I had to come up with a way to try to help my couples figure out how to do this. So I bought a squirt gun. And what I do, I keep it in my upper drawer, and when couples start generalizing, I give them one warning shot. So anybody, nobody, somebody, never, once, I just go, oh, that's a generalization, and I shoot at the ceiling. But the next one, I go for the forehead. Hey, you got to do what works, and it works. And couples will be in there, and they'll go, you never, and I'll go, all right. And they'll go, no, please, no. I'll get them right in the forehead. And it's really messy when they got those sticky things on their forehead. Then ink starts drilling, How many of you think I really do that? All right. Focus on I statements rather than you statements. All right? In other words, I feel this, I think this, rather than you. See, don't say, you always come home late. See, instead of saying you always come home late, use an I statement like this. I can't believe you always come home late. That's what you do. Yeah. All right. Let's turn the page because it's going to get real warm in here in a sec. All right. 9 o'clock. At 7 o'clock is loving confrontation. At 9 o'clock is forgiveness. forgiveness. And this is where the humor stops. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other just as God in Christ has forgiven you. What a great word. Forgiveness. The Bible teaches that all Christians are responsible to God to seek and grant forgiveness. You ever granted forgiveness to somebody? Or you ever sought forgiveness from somebody? You know, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard me talk about offending Barbara, my daughters, my neighbors, my friends. I just kind of do it all, you know. I take this manual and violate every principle in it. Some of you are going to go home, and at the end of this conference, you know, wives, you're going to be looking for the perfect mate, just like the Family Life Conference speaker. And 3 or 4 weeks from now, you'll look at your husband when he pulls a real bonehead move, and you'll say, you know, honey, Jerry Wonder never would have done that. I think Gary Rosberg would have, but Jerry, no. But see, we are here because we have all experienced difficulty. And I usually go back to kind of the core of my difficulty, which was in high school. And I was telling the guys earlier how I blew it a lot. And in my freshman year of high school, I was in a rock and roll band. And you didn't know that I was a rock and roll star, but no one else did but me. I thought I was. And I started in garage bands in '64, but was playing clubs starting in '66, 5 nights a week. So all the way through high school, I was all over big cities around the Midwest area, and literally just kind of got hooked up with a group of guys that were older than me and pretty good. But what happened is I was not developed enough to learn emotionally or morally or mentally or anything else how to deal with this thing. So my heart became very, very hard, real hard. And that all crescendoed one afternoon in June during my junior year of high school. And I was out cutting the lawn. Even rock stars have to cut lawns, you know. And we grew up in a big house in a huge yard with a rose garden that was my job to manicure. And Jerry said he likes to garden. I hate to garden because I gardened my whole life. But I was out there cutting the lawn one day, and my mom came home from doing some chores. And I remember she walked through the grass, and she had those high heels on. I can still see them with blades of grass sticking to her ankles. And she said, Gary, she said, you need to cut the lawn a second time, son, because you let it go too long. And she's kind of yelling over the old Jacobson mower. And I remember sitting back, you know, and just go, hey, Mom, you cut the lawn. You know, you're lucky and I just started barking at her. And she goes, son, I'm going to tell you one more time, you cut the lawn a second time. It's too thick, Gary, and, you know, look at it. It's all over the place. You got to cut it twice. And I had a gig that night. That's rock and roll talk for a job, you know. And I said, hey, Mom, I got a gig tonight, you know, and I just start smarting off. Now, the problem with that is you don't talk to my mother like that. You see, my dad taught me that. But I forgot. And so my mom did something that she'd never done before, never did again. She slapped me across the face. And I said, hey, Mom, don't ever. And I just kept slapping me again. Now, some of you women are going, yes. The third time she went to slap me, and I promised to this day, what I did is I put up my hands to block it. But when I put up my hands to block it, she went from hurt to sheer shock and frustration. And she said, Gary Rosberg, you get in that house, up to your room. You know, and I said, hey, cool, now I don't have to cut the lawn. Hard. I went upstairs. I'm sitting there listening to my Beatles music on my 8-track and kind of hanging around, you know, loosening up my fingers for the night. And about 25 minutes later, my little brother, Jimmy, walks into my room and said 3 words that sent a chill down my spine. He said, Dad is home. And I said, Dad who? You know, nothing's changed. And he said, Gary, don't be laughing. Dad, our dad. I said, Jimmy, I've never seen Dad in the light. I mean, you know, guy went to work at 6 in the morning, came home at 6 o'clock at night. And he said, well, he's home tonight, or he's home today. I said, how's he look? And he said, he's quiet. I went, Kitchen. Went downstairs, walked in. He said 2 sentences. First sentence, and it was a question, it was a statement. He said, son, I understand that you and your mother had a conflict. I'll never forget it. He had his back to me. He's drinking a cup of coffee, making a noise with his nose that still drives me crazy. And I thought, well, my mom's leaning against the sink. And I said, well, yeah, he sounds all right. And so I started with my rap. And my rap was, hey, Dad, you know, it's no big thing, you know, Mom. And then he said 22 words that changed my life. He said, son, you can mess with anybody in the world. But the day you mess with your mother, or your sister, you mess with me. Count them. It's 22. He turned around. He had fire in his eyes. You see, I was raised to honor my mother and to honor my sister above all else. And nobody messed with my father's wife and daughter. The boys, he let us go, but not the girl. And my dad took me down. We had a knockdown, drag-out fight in the formal dining room of this home. My mom was weeping, crying. My little brother was watching. It was a blue light special. 2 for 1. He never did anything wrong after that, I tell you. Dad and I went at it, and I twisted the knife a little bit more, because as we were rolling on the floor, I said, you can't do this to me. I'm moving out. I'm going to Old Town. Now, Old Town was a hippie colony in Chicago. And he said, fine, I'll get your luggage. I didn't expect that. And so I said, fine, Dad, that's cool. So he walks into my room a minute later, throws a bag, and he says, you're done. And I said, fine. I packed my bag, put my Ringo boots in there, my bell bottoms, packed up my Farfisa organ, rolled up my London Palladium 1964 Beatles poster. I still have it. Put it in the suitcase and laid on the bed for the last few minutes, drinking up what I knew to be a safe and secure environment. And then something kind of called me to my dad's bathroom, which overlooked the yard. And I went in there and go to the medicine chest and grab my English leather cologne. I thought even a runaway has to smell good, There are girls down there in that hippie colony. And so I'm grabbing my English leather, and what I know today is that the Holy Spirit drew me to a window. Remember those old steel Venetian blinds, real thick things? Well, I went over there. They were closed, and it overlooked the yard. And for some reason, I put my fingers in and pulled them apart, and I looked out, and there was my father, standing by his English sports car, right overlooking the yard, overlooking the garden. And I stood there in my mockery and thought, he's probably thinking now he's going to get one of my brothers to cut this thing. And I stood up there. He didn't know I was there. But then he did something that I've never seen him do before, and I've never seen him do since. He put his head on the hood of his car, and he openly wept. And I thought, what have I done? That's what I thought. And God did a work within many seconds. And I thought, I got to go to my dad. I went down the stairs and out the front door and came whipping. I was running towards him. Came whipping around the house, and he was about 30 yards off. And you know what he did? He saw me, and he started to run towards me. And when we met, he held on. And I thought, I don't deserve this. And we just stood there. And we both just wept, And later my mom told me she saw it out the window. And my dad is a very, very wise man. And he said, son, we need to talk. And I said, I know. And we went and sat on a bench underneath a magnolia tree that had just blossomed. Right next to the gas grill where we grilled every Sunday, 12 feet away from the basketball hoop that I always wanted to touch the rim. And my dad made the most astute insight in my life. And he said, son, he said, you have wounded your family. We are hurt. We are angry. See, it was an open loop. And he said, Gary, we don't know what to do with you. And he said, but I know that you crossed the line today with your mom. And I said, I know. You're right. He said, Gary, I'm going to give you 2 options. And I said, what are they? Listen to this. He said, the first option is 30 days. No band, no Lake Michigan beach, no car, no nothing. I said, what's my other option? You know what he said? He said, we can forget the whole thing ever happened. And we can start from scratch. And I said, Dad, let's go over those again. And he said, Gary, he said, let's just start over right now. But let's do it together. And I sat back and I said, I'll tell you what, Dad. I'll take the 30 days. And he said, Gary, you don't need to do that. And I said, oh, yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. You see, what he did is he loved me enough to put a boundary around me. He loved me enough to say, enough. Stop. And I can honestly tell you from that day on, we have never even had a coarse word between us. I've never crossed the line again. I've blown it, but I've never wounded, I don't think, anybody like I had done that day. And when I was writing Choosing to Love Again, which is just forgiveness, that's all the book's about. I was out visiting a guy named John Trent. He probably read his stuff, and he's a wonderful guy. And he said, Rosberg, what is this passion in you on forgiveness? And I said, I don't know, John. And I went to bed that night in a Marriott in Phoenix, Arizona, woke up at 5 o'clock the next morning, and got out a legal pad and began to write the story of the two prodigals, which is chapter 2 in this book. And I went and met with John at 7:30 that morning, having poured my heart out. And I showed it to him, and he said, that is your life story. You see, just like Dr. Luke wrote for us in Luke 15 with another prodigal, that father also waited for his son. And that dad must have had some first century binoculars. And I believe that that dad stood by the road, and he stood by the gate and waited for his son to come home. And I don't think the men of that first century experience were any different than my dad's friends. Because what a lot of men would do is they would close off their own hearts to their children and stand back and go, yeah, just try to come home. Or we're not letting you home. Or we're not going to receive you back. But what did the prodigal son's father did? What he did is he looked for that son. And when he saw that son, he ran to him, much like my dad did. And folks, some of you need to run to each other. You've hurt each other. I mean, if I could come down and sit with you and listen to the pain that some of you have experienced, you have deeply, deeply wounded each other. And you have parents that are wounded, you have kids that are wounded, you have friends that are wounded. And I'm no different than you. I've done it. But God is the God of restoration. He is the God of reconciliation. And ladies and gentlemen, if we don't model it, if we don't lead in our own homes and in our own relationships, our children will never see it and our culture will never see it. You see, we need to close the loop. We need to close it. And if you're going to close it, you need to follow just a couple steps, and I'm going to wrap this up quick, I promise. But here's what they are. Letter A says that the Bible will teach us that we're responsible. Letter B says the offender needs to seek forgiveness. We need to seek it. And I call this whole forgiveness, and here are the 4 parts to whole forgiveness. The first part is, I am wrong. You see, if I go to Barbara and say, hey, Barb, if I did something, then I'm wrong. It doesn't cut it, at least in my house. I am wrong. That's called confession. But that's only the first step. The second step is, I am sorry. I'm sorry. Honey, I am. It doesn't cut it again to say, well, if I did something to bother you, I guess I'm sorry. That is chump change. When we go to something, we say, I am wrong, I am sorry. We begin to lay the foundation for forgiveness. Sets us up for the third part, which is repentance. And here's what it sounds like. I don't ever, 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 ever want to hurt you again like I've hurt you. And see, that's when hearts begin to restore. And so we go to, I am wrong, I am sorry, I don't ever want to do this again. And we turn our back, which is what repentance is, on that sin. And then we set ourselves into the grace of that other person and a holy God and say, will you forgive me? And when you lay that open to another person, ladies and gentlemen, you are wide open for that person to either exercise grace or that person to slam dunk you. And sometimes, and this may sound harsh and I don't mean it to do, but sometimes what we do in relationships is we use this issue of forgiveness in an inappropriate way, and we abuse God's grace. And we continue to offend, and we continue to offend, and then we project this guilt on the other person and say, hey, you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, you got to forgive me. That's not God's design. Because if you are seeking forgiveness, you need to show repentance. Letter C, the offended needs to grant that forgiveness. You see, the offender needs to seek it. The offended needs to grant it. And granting forgiveness isn't, and I call these myths, it isn't repression or pretending that something didn't happen or it didn't hurt. It did happen, and it does hurt. Okay? It's history. It's happened. Letter B, it's not conditional. And letter C is, it's not forgetting. Who forgets by the way? God. As far as, I don't know where I'm at, the east from the west. But we don't forget. We're not intended to forget. So some people say, well, I haven't forgiven because I haven't forgotten. That's right. They're not the same thing. You can choose to forgive. You choose to love that person. Okay, but don't forget it. In fact, and stick with me, and I wish you were in my office so I could really walk through this with you. But in fact, what we need to do is sometimes we need to bring the issues back up as we proceed through life and as we gain more life experience, and God teaches us more about it. Not bring it up to hold it over the person's head to beat them up, but to bring it up to restore it. And to say, you know what? I've just been thinking about some of that stuff that's happened 10 years ago. And honey, I just want to check it out again. How are we doing on that? How are you doing? See, don't push it aside. Don't deny it. Letter D, it's not impossible. I can't forgive you really means I'm not ready to forgive you. And letter E, an automatic cure for the hurt. Hurt will remain. Anger will diminish, resentment will diminish, bitterness will diminish, but you know what? Hurt remains. And when you access the deep, deep woundedness of your life, the hurt's still there. Do my parents still feel some hurt over what happened back in 1968, 69? Oh, yeah. I gave my dad the manuscript to this book because, again, he's just, I don't know. I don't know how he survives. I don't know how he lives with his body. Can't do surgery. The vein structure's shot. There's nothing they can do. And 11 o'clock at night, it woke my dad up. And I said, Dad, I want you to read this because you may not be here this summer when it comes out in print. He stayed up all night and read the book. Came down the next morning. I'll never forget. And he said, you know, son, he said, that chapter 2 on the prodigal? And I said, yeah. He said, we've never talked about that again. And I said, I know. I said, is it okay? And he goes, yeah. He said, Gary, he said, I didn't know if I blew it or if I won there. I said, Dad, you won. High five. I give him a high five. I do that. Number 2, granting forgiveness is obedience. Here are the biblical constructs, all right? Number 1 is obedience, and then we don't have a blank in there, but also humility, and third is courage. If you're going to forgive somebody, then you need to choose to do that out of obedience to God, out of humility, and out of courage. Granting forgiveness is also an attitude of letting go of the resentment. It's an action that must be expressed. In letter D, it's a choice. And in letter E, the beginning of the healing process that leads to oneness is granting the forgiveness. And then, on the next page, in the final page, we get to what happens at 11 o'clock on the hour. Forgiveness begins the process by which trust can be rebuilt. Forgiveness begins the process by which trust can be rebuilt. In other words, at the 11 o'clock hour, when we close the loop, we need to rebuild the trust. And don't put your paws in the air. But if you've ever granted forgiveness, you know it's not over. You have to rebuild it. And that takes months and years to rebuild a broken relationship. How do you do it? The offending partner must take the initiative in rebuilding it. The offending partner must take the initiative. And number 2, the offended partner must resist the natural tendency to rehearse the hurt. So forgiveness begins the process by which trust can be rebuilt. Take the initiative and resist rehearsing the hurt. And letter E, discuss specific solutions to the problem. What do we do about the hurt we still feel? What do we change? And what do we do if we still disagree? Letter F, seeking and granting forgiveness in this way restores oneness.
That was Family Life Weekend to Remember conference speaker Gary Rosberg speaking about resolving conflict. On the next CD, we'll hear from Dan Allender on resolving conflict through the power of blessing.